Mafia boss entered the room quietly and saw the black maid praying for his son. He couldn't speak. The mansion was enormous, a fortress of marble and steel, hidden away behind wrought iron gates that stood like sentinels in the sprawling hills just outside of the city. The air was thick with the scent of polished wood, expensive cologne, and freshly cut roses. This was the kind of place where only the most powerful could walk with their heads held high, where the shadows of past deeds were buried beneath the weight of money, power, and influence. Inside, the atmosphere was tense, like a slow-burning fuse waiting to explode. In the grand hallway, with its vaulted ceilings and golden chandeliers, one would think the world outside did not exist. But in the next room, it was a different story. There, in a small, cozy space far from the eyes of the family, a young black woman was kneeling on the floor beside a small bed. Her name was Sarah, and though she had been working as a maid in this house for a little over 6 months, her life had never been easy. She wasn't supposed to be here. This room was off limits to the staff, but tonight was different. The child in the bed, young Marco, the mafia boss's son, was in pain. He had been crying for hours, his tiny body shaking with fever. No one knew what to do. The doctors had come and gone, leaving only useless prescriptions. The nurse had quit that morning, her nerves shattered from the relentless demands of the job. Sarah had lost her own child years ago, and though the pain never truly went away, her body still remembered what it was like to care for a sick child. She couldn't stand hearing Marco's cries, so she decided to break the rules. She had no authority here. She wasn't supposed to be near the child at all, but she couldn't stand the thought of him suffering when there was something she could do. She quietly entered the room, her heart pounding with every step. As she knelt beside Marco, she whispered to him softly, trying to comfort him with the soothing voice that had once calmed her own daughter. She didn't know what else to do, so she began to pray. She prayed for Marco's pain to go away, for his little body to find peace. As she prayed, she felt the weight of the room shift. She wasn't sure what had changed, but something in the air was different. The door creaked open, and the room went still. Sarah's eyes snapped open, and she froze. There, standing silently in the doorway, was Dominic Castellano, the mafia boss. His sharp features were softened by the dim light that filtered through the window, but his presence was unmistakable. He was a giant, not only in stature but in power. His hands, large and scarred from years of hard work and violence, clenched at his sides as he watched Sarah with something unreadable in his eyes. He hadn't made a sound when he entered, and yet somehow she had known he was there. His gaze fell on her, kneeling beside his son, and for a moment, everything stopped. Sarah was terrified. She had broken the rules. She had violated his space. She could lose her job, or worse, if he decided she was a threat. But then something happened that she did not expect. Dominic did not speak. He simply stood there, watching her, his dark eyes flickering between her and the child. There was a strange stillness in his expression, a quiet that felt as heavy as the storm clouds outside. For a few long seconds, no one moved. It was as if time itself had slowed down. Sarah's heart raced, but she didn't move. She couldn't. Then, in the silence, she heard it. A single word, barely a whisper. Stay. Dominic's voice was rough, like he hadn't spoken in days, but there was something else behind it. Something softer. Something human. For a moment, Sarah thought she had imagined it. But then he spoke again, his voice barely louder than a breath. He's my son. His words hung in the air, and Sarah felt the weight of them sink into her chest. She wasn't sure what she expected, but it wasn't this. He had seen her, truly seen her, for the first time, and in that moment, everything changed. The room remained eerily quiet, the only sound being the soft rustle of Sarah's prayer, her voice barely above a whisper. As she knelt beside Marco's small bed, the feverish child in her arms, her mind raced. She had never imagined she would find herself here, breaking every rule she had learned as a maid. The tension in the room was thick, but it was not just the presence of Dominic Castellano that made it so. It was the silent understanding that was growing between them, the softening of a man who was known for his cruelty and power. Dominic stood there, still and silent, watching the scene unfold before him. He had come into the room without a sound, his movements smooth and calculated, as they always were. But now, as he saw Sarah's calm, steady hands holding Marco, his heart skipped a beat. She was praying for his son, a child he had failed to protect from the suffering that had racked his small body. Dominic felt a strange sense of discomfort. He was not used to being moved by such acts of kindness, especially not by someone like Sarah, a woman who was nothing more than an employee in his vast empire, a mere maid to be ordered around. But as he stood there, watching her, he realized he had misjudged her. He had seen her as nothing more than a worker, a person to be ignored. But now, as he looked at her praying over his son, he saw something else. He saw a strength in her, a quiet grace that he had never expected to find in someone like her. As Sarah continued to pray, Dominic's mind wandered back to the time when Marco was born. He had been so young, so full of life, and Dominic had promised himself he would do whatever it took to protect him, to shield him from the harsh world he had created. But now, as he stood in the doorway, he felt powerless. There was nothing he could do to take away his son's pain. The doctors had failed. The nurses had failed. And now, it seemed, it was up to this woman to help him, to give him the comfort and care that his own father could not. Please, Sarah's voice broke through his thoughts, soft yet pleading. Please let him rest. Dominic blinked, not realizing he had been staring. He had been so lost in his own thoughts that he hadn't noticed how his emotions were taking control. He stepped forward slowly, his movements deliberate, his gaze never leaving Sarah. You care for him, he said, his voice rough. You actually care for him. Sarah looked up at him, startled by his words. She had always known who he was, Dominic Castellano, the mafia boss who controlled everything and everyone around him. She had seen him from afar, admired his strength, but had never spoken to him. And now, here he was, standing in front of her, watching her as though he were seeing her for the first time. I do, Sarah said softly. I care for him like he was my own. Her words hung in the air, and Dominic felt something inside him shift. He had never understood what it meant to truly care for someone. His entire life had been about power, control, and domination. He had never allowed himself to feel vulnerable, to show weakness, not even in the face of his own son's suffering. But now, as he looked at Sarah, he realized that he had been wrong. For all his power, for all his wealth, he had never known love in the way Sarah did. And in that moment, he saw something else in her eyes, something that made his heart ache with a longing he had never experienced before. I'm sorry, Dominic whispered, his voice breaking. Sarah blinked in surprise. She had never heard him speak so softly, so vulnerably. He was the mafia boss, the man who had made people fear him with a single glance. And yet, here he was, apologizing, his shoulders slumped with regret. What are you sorry for? She asked, her voice trembling. Dominic ran a hand through his hair, looking away. I'm sorry I couldn't protect him, he said quietly. I'm sorry I failed him. Sarah's heart went out to him. For all his cold exterior, for all his power, she could see the pain in his eyes. He wasn't just a ruthless mafia boss. He was a father, a man who loved his son, and who was struggling to cope with the helplessness of the situation. You're not the one who failed, Sarah said softly, placing a hand on Marco's forehead to check his temperature. Sometimes, we can't fix everything, but we can still be there for them, just like you're here for him now. Dominic stared at her, his heart beating faster. Her words were like a balm to his tortured soul. For the first time in years, he felt something other than rage, other than the need for power. He felt compassion, and it was in that moment that Dominic Castellano knew. His life would never be the same. He had come into this room expecting to find the same cold, indifferent woman he had always known, but instead, he found something far more valuable, a reminder of what it meant to be human. The silence in the room was thick, heavy with an unspoken tension that neither Sarah nor Dominic could ignore. As she sat there beside Marco, her hands gently resting on the fevered child, she could feel his temperature finally beginning to lower. The soothing prayer she had whispered seemed to have calmed him, and for a moment, there was nothing but peace in the room. But the peace was fleeting, as the weight of Dominic's presence began to feel suffocating again. Dominic had not moved since he spoke those soft words. I'm sorry. Sarah had looked up at him in surprise, unsure how to respond to a man she had always known to be cold, calculating, and distant. He was a man who commanded power with a single glance, a man whose name alone sent shivers down the spines of the most hardened criminals. And yet, here he was, standing in front of her, vulnerable and broken. She could see it now, the pain in his eyes. It wasn't just the pain of his son's suffering. It was the pain of a man who had spent his entire life building walls, only to realize that they couldn't protect the ones he loved the most. As Sarah gently adjusted the blankets around Marco, she noticed that Dominic had not taken his eyes off her. His gaze was intense, but there was no anger, no coldness. There was something else, something raw, something real. She could feel her own heart racing as she stood up, wiping her hands on her apron, not sure of what to say next. The room seemed to shrink around them, and for a brief moment, all the rules that governed their relationship, the divide between employer and employee, between the powerful and the powerless, seemed irrelevant. "Sarah," Dominic said finally, his voice steady but heavy with emotion. "You saved him." Sarah's heart skipped a beat. She had never thought of herself as a savior. She was just a maid, just a woman trying to survive in a world that had never been kind to her. But the way Dominic said it, the way he looked at her, made her wonder if maybe she had done something more than just comfort his son. She had given him something that even his vast wealth and power could not buy: hope. "I just did what I could," she replied quietly, her voice almost a whisper. "I couldn't just stand by and do nothing. He's just a child." Dominic nodded slowly, his gaze never leaving hers. "You're right," he murmured. "He's just a child. And I failed him." Sarah's heart ached at his words. She had never heard him speak so openly, so vulnerably. For a man like Dominic Castellano, admitting failure was not something he did lightly. She could see the weight of his words in the way his shoulders were hunched, in the way his hands were clenched at his sides. "You haven't failed him," Sarah said softly, stepping closer to him. "You're here. That's all that matters. You're here now, and that's what counts." For the first time, she saw something in Dominic's eyes that surprised her, a flicker of gratitude, a spark of something deep and human. He didn't say anything, but in that moment, it felt like he understood. His expression softened, just for a moment, and he took a step closer to her. "I don't know how to do this," he said quietly. "I don't know how to be what he needs." Sarah felt a lump form in her throat. She had spent so many years of her life just trying to survive, just trying to make sure she had enough to eat, that she had never stopped to think about what it meant to truly care for someone. She had spent so long hiding from her own pain, from the grief of losing her daughter, that she had never allowed herself to fully open up to anyone. But now, standing before Dominic, she felt a strange sense of connection to him, a shared understanding that neither of them had the answers, but together, they might find a way forward. "You don't have to have all the answers," Sarah said softly, her voice steady. "You just have to be there. For him. For yourself." Dominic's lips parted, as if he were about to say something, but then he closed them again, his expression thoughtful. It was clear that he was processing her words, trying to make sense of them in a life that had been so complicated, so driven by power and control. Sarah could see the internal struggle in his eyes. He was not used to feeling vulnerable, not used to accepting help from anyone, especially not someone like her. But somehow, in this small, quiet moment, they were both learning something new. They were learning that it wasn't weakness to care, that it wasn't failure to be human. And as Dominic finally reached out and placed a hand gently on Marco's head, Sarah couldn't help but feel that the world was shifting, just a little. Perhaps, just perhaps, they were both starting to heal. The room was quiet, save for the soft breathing of the child and the rhythmic beat of Sarah's heart. She watched as Dominic sat by the bedside, his strong hand gently resting on Marco's small, fevered head. The tension that had once filled the air had finally begun to dissipate, replaced with an unexpected calm. For the first time since the night had begun, Sarah allowed herself to breathe. She had no idea what had brought Dominic to this point, this moment of vulnerability, but she could feel that something had changed. The man who had once appeared so cold, so unreachable, was now sitting beside her, his attention solely focused on his son. It was a side of Dominic she had never expected to see. Sarah had known about the man's reputation, how he ruled with an iron fist, how he was feared by everyone in his orbit. She had heard the whispers, the stories of his power, his ruthlessness. But in this room, with the soft glow of the bedside lamp illuminating his features, Sarah saw something different. She saw a man who was deeply affected by the pain of his child, a father who was struggling to do what he could not do, and it shook her in ways she could not describe. For the first time, she saw him as more than just the mafia boss. He was a parent, just like her, trying to navigate the complexities of love and loss. I don't know what to do. Dominic's voice was rough, barely audible, as he turned to Sarah. His eyes met hers, and in that instant, she saw the rawness in them, the uncertainty, the fear. I've spent my whole life controlling everything, controlling people. But with him, I don't know how to help him. I don't know what's enough. Sarah felt her heartache for him. She could hear the pain in his words, the guilt. She knew he was used to being in control, to being the one who made the decisions, the one who called the shots. But when it came to his son, he was helpless. She could relate. As a mother, she had often felt helpless, watching her child struggle and not knowing how to fix it. But she had learned, over the years, that sometimes there was no solution. Sometimes, all you could do was be there. You don't have to have all the answers, Sarah said quietly, her voice steady despite the turmoil inside her. You just need to be here. That's enough. He needs you. Dominic looked at her, his expression unreadable. For a moment, Sarah wasn't sure if he had heard her, but then, his lips parted slightly. I'm here, he said softly. I've always been here, but it's never felt like enough. His words hung in the air, heavy with regret. Sarah nodded, understanding the depth of his pain. It wasn't just the suffering of his son. It was his own internal battle, his own guilt. For a man who had always prided himself on being in control, on being the one who dictated the terms of everything, this helplessness was foreign and uncomfortable. Sometimes being here is all they need, Sarah said gently. You don't have to fix everything. Just be present. Dominic's gaze softened, just for a moment. I've never known how to do that, he admitted. Sarah could see the conflict in his eyes. It was as though he was fighting against something deep inside himself, a part of him that had always believed in strength and dominance. To admit vulnerability, to admit that he didn't have all the answers, was difficult for him. But Sarah could see that he was trying, and that was something. That was more than most people ever did. You're trying now, she said, offering him a small, reassuring smile. And that's all anyone can ask for. Dominic took a deep breath, exhaling slowly as if releasing some of the tension he had been holding on to. He glanced at Marco, who was still sleeping soundly, the fever finally breaking. Thank you, he said, his voice barely a whisper. For staying. For helping. Sarah shook her head. I'm just doing what anyone would do. Dominic looked at her, his eyes lingering on her face, as if seeing her for the first time. You're not just anyone, he said quietly. You've done something no one else could. You've helped me when I didn't even know I needed help. There was something in his voice now, something sincere, something vulnerable. It was the sound of a man who was learning, who was growing. And for the first time, Sarah felt a glimmer of hope. Maybe, just maybe, they were both changing. You don't have to thank me, Sarah said, her voice soft. Just promise me you'll be there for him. He needs you more than anything. Dominic nodded, his expression serious. I promise. As he said the words, Sarah could see the weight lift slightly from his shoulders. It was as if, for the first time in a long while, he had found a way to let go of the things he couldn't control. And in that moment, as they both watched Marco sleep peacefully, it felt like they were both learning how to be human again. Slowly, but surely, they were finding their way back to each other. And maybe, just maybe, they were beginning to understand what it really meant to care. The next few days were unlike any that Sarah had ever experienced working in the Castellano mansion. Things had changed, and she could feel the shift in the air. Dominic, the man she had once seen as an untouchable figure, was no longer just the powerful mafia boss who ran his empire with fear and precision. He had become something different. And as she worked, moving quietly through the halls of the mansion, she saw him with new eyes. Dominic had started showing up at odd hours, standing in the hallway outside Marco's room, or just lingering near the living area, deep in thought. He was not the man who commanded his world with a cold stare, but instead, he seemed lost in his own thoughts. The walls he had built over the years, those walls that had kept him from truly feeling anything, were slowly crumbling, one small piece at a time. Sarah noticed it, though she never spoke of it. It wasn't something she felt was her place to acknowledge. Yet, there was no denying that the change was real. One evening, after finishing her tasks for the day, Sarah found herself walking through the mansion's garden. The fresh air was a welcome escape, and she often found herself drawn to the solitude of the garden to clear her mind. She had lost her own child years ago, and while the pain never fully left her, she had learned to find peace in the quiet moments. As she walked past the fountain, she saw Dominic standing by the stone railing, looking out over the garden. He hadn't noticed her, and for a moment, Sarah considered turning back, but something stopped her. She felt drawn to him, to the man who had opened up to her in a way no one had before. Slowly, she approached, unsure of what to say. "You're not going to stay in there all night, are you?" Sarah's voice broke the silence. Dominic turned, surprised, but then a small smile tugged at the corner of his mouth. "I might," he replied. "There's peace here, a kind of peace I've never really known." Sarah didn't know how to respond. She had never expected to hear him speak so candidly. "What's changed?" she asked, her voice soft, not wanting to intrude but needing to understand. Dominic took a deep breath, the weight of the question evident on his face. "I don't know," he said quietly. "I've spent my entire life controlling everything. Every person, every situation, every single moment. But with Marco, I can't control it. I can't fix it. I can't make it better. And that scares me." Sarah looked at him, really looked at him, for the first time. The man she had known, commanding, untouchable, was now standing before her, vulnerable. The raw honesty in his words caught her off guard. "You're not alone in feeling like that," she said gently. "We all want to fix things. We all want to be able to make the pain go away. But sometimes, the best thing we can do is just be there. Just show up, even when we don't have the answers." Dominic nodded slowly, the weight of her words settling over him. "It's hard for me," he admitted. "Letting go of control. Letting things happen as they will." Sarah smiled, understanding more than she had before. "We all want to control the things we love," she said. "But love doesn't work that way. It's messy, unpredictable, and often out of our hands. You don't need to fix it. Just be there. That's enough." Dominic's expression softened, and for a moment, Sarah could see the layers of pain and regret that he had buried deep within himself. She had always known him as the man who held all the power, the one who made everyone around him fear him. But in this moment, she saw the father, fragile, uncertain, and trying his best. "Thank you," he said, his voice sincere. "For everything." Sarah nodded, her heart swelling with a mix of empathy and understanding. She had never expected to form a connection with him, especially not in this way. "It's nothing," she said, though it meant more to her than she could express. As the days passed, Sarah continued to watch Dominic. She noticed small changes in him. How he would stop by Marco's room more often, how he would linger by the window, watching over his son. He wasn't the same man who had walked into that room weeks ago. He was softer, more present, and it was clear that his love for Marco had become his guiding light. One evening, as she was finishing her duties, Sarah found herself standing by the kitchen door, watching as Dominic sat on the couch with Marco. The child, now much better, was laughing, his tiny hands reaching out for his father's finger. Dominic's face lit up with something she had never seen before, a warmth that made him appear almost human. It was a quiet moment, a private one, but Sarah could see that it was a moment that meant everything to him. As she turned to leave, she couldn't help but smile. She had witnessed something beautiful, a father finding his way back to his child, and in doing so, finding his way back to himself. Days passed in a quiet rhythm, with Dominic's presence in Marco's room growing more frequent. It was subtle, but Sarah noticed the shift in him. He wasn't the man he had been when she first started working here. The walls he had built to protect himself, to shield him from emotions, were gradually breaking down. The impervious mafia boss was slowly being replaced by a father. She saw him one evening, sitting by Marco's side as the child drifted off to sleep, his hand gently resting on the boy's chest. There was no command in his posture, no cold calculation in his eyes, just a quiet tenderness, an unspoken understanding between father and son. It was a side of Dominic Sarah had never thought she'd witness, and she found herself moved by it. She wasn't the only one who noticed the change. The other staff members began to speak in hushed tones about the shift in the household. Where once Dominic was feared, a man who ruled with absolute authority, now there was a sense of respect. It wasn't out of fear anymore, but out of admiration for how he had become, in a way, more human. One afternoon, as Sarah was passing by the hallway, she heard voices from the study. She paused, a soft knock on the door before she stepped in. "You wanted to see me, Mr. Castellano?" she asked, her voice respectful yet curious. Dominic looked up from the papers he was reviewing, his usual sharp expression softening as his eyes met hers. "Yes, Sarah. Come in," he said, his tone quieter than usual. There was no hint of the coldness that had defined him for so long. "Please sit." Sarah did as she was told, the weight of the invitation not lost on her. In the months she had worked at the mansion, she had never been asked to sit. It felt strange, almost surreal. "How's Marco doing?" she asked, trying to keep the conversation neutral. Dominic leaned back in his chair, his hands folding together as he exhaled. "Better. His fever broke completely last night." He paused, staring out the window for a long moment before meeting her gaze. "You were right. About everything." Sarah tilted her head, unsure of what he meant. "About what?" "About being there for him," he said. "I didn't understand it before. I thought I had to fix everything, make everything right. But with him, it's different. It's not about fixing things, it's about being present. It's about showing him love." The sincerity in his voice caught Sarah off guard. She had never imagined that Dominic Castellano, the mafia boss who commanded fear and respect, would ever admit to such vulnerability. But here he was, admitting that he didn't have all the answers, that he didn't always know what to do. "It's not easy," Sarah said softly, "especially when you've spent your whole life being taught that power is the solution to everything." Dominic nodded. "Exactly. But I'm learning. And you were right, Sarah. It's not about power. It's about connection." She didn't know how to respond to that. She had always seen him as a man who lived and breathed power. But now, she saw a different side of him, a side that was willing to learn, to grow, to let go of the things he had once held so tightly. "You've made a difference," Dominic continued, his voice quieter now. "You've made me see things differently. I thought I had all the answers, but you showed me that I didn't, that I don't need to." His words hung in the air, and for a moment, Sarah didn't know what to say. This was not the man she had expected to find in this mansion, the ruthless, cold leader of the Castellano family. This was a man who was learning to let go, to accept that not everything was within his control. And in that moment, Sarah felt something shift inside of her as well. The man sitting in front of her was no longer just the mafia boss. He was a father, a person who was doing his best to change, to grow. "I'm glad to hear that," Sarah said softly. "You're doing the right thing." Dominic studied her for a moment, his expression unreadable. Then, in a rare moment of vulnerability, he spoke again. "You know, I never thought I'd be the type to learn from someone like you," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. "But you've shown me a kind of strength that I didn't know existed." Sarah felt her heart skip a beat. She had never expected such words from him, especially not after everything that had transpired between them. But here he was, offering her an apology of sorts, acknowledging that she had been right all along. "It's not about strength, Dominic," she replied quietly. "It's about love. It's about showing up for the people you care about, even when you don't know what to do. That's the hardest thing, letting yourself care." Dominic looked down for a moment, his hands folding in his lap as he absorbed her words. Then, finally, he nodded. "I think I'm starting to understand that," he said. And in that moment, Sarah realized that maybe, just maybe, Dominic Castellano wasn't the man she had once thought him to be. Maybe, just maybe, he was becoming the man he was always meant to be, the kind of man who could show up for the people he loved, and the kind of father Marco needed. It wasn't about power. It was about heart. And in the silence that followed, Sarah knew that Dominic was finally learning what it meant to be truly present in someone's life. The days continued to pass, and with each one, the bond between Dominic and his son Marco grew stronger. It was a bond that Sarah could see growing before her eyes, in small moments. Moments where Dominic would sit quietly beside Marco's bed, watching over him as he slept, or moments where he would hold Marco's hand during meals, gently guiding him through the simplest of tasks. For the first time in his life, Dominic was learning to be vulnerable, and it was a sight that made Sarah's heart swell with quiet pride. He had come so far from the man he once was, the man who ruled with an iron fist, who cared for nothing but his own power. And though he still carried the weight of his empire on his shoulders, Sarah could see the change in him. It was in the way he smiled at Marco, a rare smile that reached his eyes, or the way he would hold Sarah's gaze a little longer than necessary, as if trying to understand her, as if trying to find a way to connect. But as much as Dominic had changed, Sarah knew that he still had his demons to face. There were still parts of himself he refused to confront, parts that had been buried so deep that even he had forgotten they were there. One afternoon, after a long day of work, Sarah found herself in the kitchen, cleaning up after dinner. The staff had long since gone home, leaving the house quiet, save for the soft hum of the refrigerator. As she wiped down the counter, she heard footsteps behind her, slow and deliberate. She turned to find Dominic standing in the doorway, his posture rigid, his expression unreadable. "Sarah," he said, his voice low, "can I talk to you for a moment?" Sarah felt her heart skip a beat. There was something different in his voice, something that made her pause. She set the dishcloth down and nodded, gesturing for him to come in. "Of course. What's on your mind?" Dominic hesitated for a moment before stepping into the room, his eyes searching hers as though weighing his. "Next words carefully. I don't know how to say this," he began, his voice tight with emotion. "But I need to thank you." Sarah blinked in surprise, not expecting those words. She had always been the one to offer help, to offer comfort, but she had never expected Dominic to offer it back to her. "Thank me? For what?" she asked, genuinely confused. "For helping me see what I've been missing," he replied, his voice almost a whisper. "For helping me be the father I need to be." He paused, taking a deep breath. "For showing me what real strength is." Sarah could feel her heart swell with emotion at his words. This man, who had once been the embodiment of power and control, was now admitting that he needed help, that he was learning how to be vulnerable. "You've done all of this on your own," she said softly. "You've made the choice to change. I'm just here to help however I can." Dominic stepped closer, his eyes never leaving hers. "You've done more than that," he said, his voice growing more intense. "You've shown me that there's more to life than just power. That love, that connection, that's what truly matters." Sarah was taken aback by the sincerity in his words. She had never imagined that the man who had built an empire on fear and intimidation could ever speak like this, could ever understand the importance of love and connection. "I've spent my whole life thinking that power was everything," Dominic continued, his gaze never wavering. "But now, I realize I've been living in a prison of my own making. I've been so focused on control that I lost sight of what really matters." Sarah could see the weight of those words in his eyes. This was no longer just a conversation. It was a man confronting the truth of his own life, his own choices. "You're not alone in that," she said softly. "We all make mistakes. We all lose sight of things sometimes. But what matters is that you're trying, that you're here for Marco, that you're here for yourself." Dominic closed his eyes for a brief moment, as though trying to gather his thoughts. When he opened them again, there was a new determination in his gaze. "I don't know what the future holds," he said, his voice steady. "But I do know one thing. I won't make the same mistakes again. I won't let the walls I built keep me from what really matters." Sarah smiled, feeling a warmth spread through her chest. For the first time, she saw Dominic not as the feared mafia boss, but as a man who had begun to find his way. Someone who was willing to change, to grow, to become the person he was always meant to be. "That's all anyone can do," she said quietly. "Take it one day at a time." Dominic's expression softened, and for a moment, he seemed to let go of the burden that had weighed so heavily on him for so long. "Thank you," he said again, his voice full of gratitude. "I don't think I could have done this without you." Sarah shook her head, her heart light. "You did it, Dominic. You did it on your own. I was just here to help you see that." He nodded, a small smile tugging at his lips. "I'll never forget this," he said softly. "I'll never forget what you've done for me." And as Sarah watched him turn and leave the kitchen, a small part of her knew that the man who had once been a symbol of fear and power had truly begun to change. And in that moment, she felt something shift inside of herself too, an understanding that, sometimes, the greatest strength came not from power, but from allowing oneself to love and be loved in return. As the days turned into weeks, Sarah continued to observe the transformation in Dominic, though she never said anything aloud. He had become a man of few words, but his actions spoke volumes. There was a quiet understanding between them now, one that had grown out of shared experiences, shared moments of vulnerability. And as much as Dominic had changed, she felt herself changing as well. She had never imagined that the harsh, powerful man she once feared would become someone she could trust, someone she could even admire. But there he was, a father who had faced his demons, and was now slowly letting go of his need for control. And she, too, had started to heal, something she hadn't expected. One evening, as Sarah was walking down the long hallway, she passed by Marco's room. The door was slightly ajar, and she could hear Dominic's voice, soft and comforting, as he spoke. To his son, she paused, unable to resist the urge to listen. "It's okay, Marco," Dominic's voice said, full of tenderness. "You're safe now. Everything is going to be okay." She could hear the sound of Marco's small, innocent giggles, a sound that warmed Sarah's heart. She knew then, in that moment, that Dominic had finally learned what it meant to truly be there for his son. The next morning, as Sarah was finishing her tasks, she was called into the study. Dominic was sitting at his desk, papers scattered in front of him, but his eyes were not on the papers. They were on her. "Sarah," he began, his voice steady, though there was a hint of uncertainty behind his words. "I need to ask you something." She raised an eyebrow, unsure of what he meant. "What's on your mind?" "I've been thinking," he said slowly. "I've never thanked you properly for what you've done. For Marco. For me. For everything." Sarah blinked, surprised by the sincerity in his words. "You don't need to thank me," she said softly. "I did what anyone would do." Dominic shook his head, his expression serious. "No, you did more than that. You've helped me become a better father. And for that, I can never repay you." Sarah felt a lump form in her throat. She had never expected to hear such words from Dominic. He had always been the one who held power, who gave orders, but now, here he was, offering gratitude, offering something more. "It's just the right thing to do," she said quietly. Dominic stood up from his desk and walked over to her, his gaze never leaving hers. He was close now, much closer than she was used to, and for the first time, she noticed how different he seemed. The once imposing man now seemed less like a predator and more like a person, vulnerable, human. "I want you to know that I see you, Sarah," he said, his voice soft but firm. "I see what you've done for me, for Marco, for this family. And I want you to know that you matter. You've made a difference." Sarah's heart raced, her mind struggling to process his words. She had never thought of herself as someone who could make a difference. She was just a maid, a woman doing the best she could to survive in a world that didn't always make room for her. But here, in this moment, with Dominic's eyes locked on hers, she felt something shift inside of her. "Thank you," Dominic said, his voice low. "You've done more than you'll ever know." She felt her face flush with emotion, unsure of how to respond. "I'm just glad I could help," she said, her voice barely a whisper. Dominic nodded, his gaze softening. He stepped back slightly, giving her space, but the connection between them remained. "I've spent too much of my life thinking that power and control were the answer to everything," he said, his voice distant, as if lost in thought. "But you've shown me that there's more to life than that. You've shown me what it means to care, to be there for someone, without expecting anything in return." There was a pause, as if Dominic was searching for the right words that would finally express the gratitude he felt. "You've helped me see that love and care are the true measures of strength. And for that, I will always be grateful." Sarah stood there, her heart heavy with the weight of his words. She never expected to hear something like this from him. The man who had ruled with an iron fist, who had used fear to control everyone around him, was now admitting that there was more to life than that. He was admitting that he, too, had learned from her. It was a quiet revelation, but one that spoke volumes. "You're not alone, Dominic," Sarah said softly, her voice steady. "You're not alone in this. You have people who care about you. You've always had that." Dominic looked at her, his eyes dark but soft, filled with a new understanding. He had always been the one who held power, but in this moment, he was showing her something different: vulnerability, humility, and, most importantly, love. "Thank you," he whispered again, his voice barely audible. Sarah nodded, her heart full. "You're welcome," she said, and for the first time in a long time, she felt a sense of peace. It wasn't about power. It wasn't about control. It was about love, connection, and the willingness to change. And as Dominic Castellano stood before her, no longer the man he had once been, she knew that he was finally learning what it meant to truly live. The walls had fallen, and in their place, something beautiful had taken root. A father's love, and the beginning of something new. The days continued to slip by, and the quiet moments between Dominic and Sarah became more frequent. The shift in their dynamic had not gone unnoticed by the rest of the staff. Whispers circulated in the corners of the mansion, but no one dared to speak out loud about the changes. It was as if the air itself had lightened, and there was a new, unspoken understanding among everyone. Dominic had become a more present father, more concerned with his son's well-being than with the empire he had built. The change was gradual, but it was real. One evening, after Marco had gone to bed, Dominic found Sarah sitting by the grand window in the living room, staring out at the darkening sky. The mansion was quiet, a serene stillness that felt almost surreal compared to the chaos of his usual world. He stepped into the room, and without a word, Sarah turned her head, acknowledging his presence. "Sarah," he began, his voice low, as he approached her, "I've been thinking a lot about everything that's happened." She nodded, her gaze never leaving the view. "What's been on your mind?" "You've shown me more than I ever expected," Dominic said, his tone serious. "I thought I knew everything. How to control things, how to run my life. But I've realized that there's so much more I don't understand." Sarah turned toward him then, her expression soft. She had always known Dominic as the man who controlled everything, the man who had built his empire with an iron grip. But now, she saw something else in him. Vulnerability. "No one can control everything," she said gently. "And there's no shame in that." Dominic's eyes lingered on her, and for a moment, it was as if he was seeing her for the first time, truly seeing her. "I've been blind," he admitted. "I spent so much time focusing on power, on control. I thought I had everything figured out. But with Marco, I realized how little I understood about what really matters." Sarah's heart softened at his words. She had seen this change in him over time, but hearing him speak it aloud made it feel more real. "Being a father isn't about control," she said, her voice calm and steady. "It's about being there, listening, understanding." Dominic nodded slowly, the weight of her words settling in his mind. "I've tried to do everything on my own, but I see now that I've been missing the most important thing. It's not about what I can do for Marco. It's about being with him, sharing these moments, being present." Sarah's eyes met his, and for a brief moment, the room seemed to shrink around them. There was no power struggle, no distance between them. Just two people, connected by the unspoken understanding of what it meant to care. "You're already doing it," she said, her voice soft. "The fact that you're here, trying to learn, trying to be better, that's all that matters." Dominic's jaw tightened, his expression shifting as he absorbed her words. "I've spent my whole life thinking I had to do everything myself. I didn't realize until recently that asking for help, opening up to someone, it's not weakness. It's strength." Sarah smiled, a small, knowing smile that spoke volumes. "It's never easy to let go of control, but sometimes, letting go is the best thing you can do." He looked at her, his gaze full of something deeper than she had ever seen. "I never thought I'd find someone who could teach me this," he said softly. "But you've shown me that I don't need to be alone in this." Sarah's heart gave a small flutter at his words, but she didn't let it show. "You've always had people around you," she said gently. "It's just that sometimes, we need to let others in." Dominic stepped closer, his eyes never leaving hers. "I want to thank you. For everything. For being the person who opened my eyes, who showed me what really matters." His words hung in the air, heavy with sincerity, and Sarah felt something shift inside her. It was as if, in that moment, she had crossed a line in her own heart, a line that separated her from the man she had always seen as untouchable. "You don't need to thank me," she said quietly. "I did what I could." Dominic smiled, a real smile this time, one that reached his eyes. "I'll never forget this," he said, his voice full of warmth. "You've changed my life." There was a pause, and Sarah felt the weight of those words settle in her chest. He didn't say it lightly, and she knew that he meant every word. "I'm just glad I could help," she said softly. Dominic nodded, then fell silent for a moment. He reached out, as if to touch her arm, but hesitated. Instead, he gave her a small, almost shy smile. "I have to go, but thank you again," he said, his voice thick with emotion. Sarah watched as he turned and walked toward the door, his figure disappearing into the shadows of the hallway. As the door clicked shut behind him, she felt the weight of the moment linger in the air. Something had shifted between them. Something deep and powerful, something that neither of them had expected. It wasn't about the power, the empire, or the control anymore. It was about something far more human. It was about love, connection, and the willingness to be vulnerable. And as Sarah stood in the silence of the room, she knew that this was only the beginning of something new for both of them. Days turned into weeks, and Dominic continued to settle into his new role as a father. The mansion, which once felt cold and distant, now seemed warmer with the steady presence of love and care filling the rooms. Sarah had seen the transformation unfold in front of her eyes. How Dominic, once the intimidating figure who commanded fear and respect, was becoming someone softer, someone who learned to embrace vulnerability. It was subtle, but it was undeniable. The once ironclad control Dominic had over everything, his empire, his staff, his life, was slowly melting away, replaced by moments of genuine tenderness. One morning, as Sarah was finishing her duties in the kitchen, she heard footsteps approach behind her. She turned to find Dominic standing in the doorway, his expression thoughtful. "Sarah," he said, his voice quieter than usual, "I need to ask you something." She set the dish towel down, turning her full attention to him. "Of course, Mr. Castellano. What's on your mind?" Dominic walked into the room, his posture more relaxed than it had ever been. He had a different air about him now, a man not ruled by his own expectations of power, but by the understanding of how fragile life truly was. He paused for a moment, gathering his thoughts. "I've been thinking about how much has changed," he said, almost to himself. "Not just with Marco, but with everything." "With me?" Sarah nodded, sensing that this was important. "What do you mean?" "I mean," he continued, "for so long, I've been obsessed with control, making sure I could hold everything together, running this family, running the business. I didn't know how to let go. But with Marco, I had to let go." He looked at her, his eyes filled with something she hadn't seen before, an openness, a plea for understanding. "I didn't know how to be a father. And now, I think I'm starting to understand. I see things differently now." Sarah stood in silence for a moment, letting his words sink in. "It's not easy," she said finally. "No one teaches you how to let go of control. But it's part of what makes us human, what makes us connect with others." Dominic seemed to absorb her words, his expression softening. "I always thought that if I didn't control everything, I would lose it. But with Marco, I've had to learn that control isn't what matters most." "What matters?" Sarah asked, genuinely curious. Dominic's gaze turned inward for a moment, as though he were searching for the right words. "What matters is love," he said softly. "What matters is being there for someone, not because you can fix them, but because you care." The weight of his words settled between them. Sarah could feel the change in him. The man who once defined his worth by his power now defining it by his capacity to love. "I never thought I would be the kind of person who needed love," Dominic continued, his voice barely a whisper. "But now I see that love, being there for Marco, being present, is the only thing that matters. I don't need control to show him that. I just need to be here." Sarah smiled, her heart full of understanding. "You're doing it already," she said softly. "You're here. That's all he needs." Dominic let out a slow breath, a small smile tugging at the corner of his lips. "I know," he said, looking at Sarah with gratitude in his eyes. "And I never thought I would say this, but thank you." Sarah blinked in surprise. "Thank you for showing me what I've been missing," he said, stepping closer. "For helping me see that there's more to life than power. You've opened my eyes." Sarah felt her heart skip a beat. This was the same man who had once ruled with an iron fist, the same man who had never shown a hint of vulnerability. And yet here he was, admitting that he had been wrong all along. "I didn't do anything special," she said, her voice steady. "I just did what anyone would do." Dominic's gaze softened as he stepped closer to her, his voice almost a whisper. "No, you did more than anyone could have." His words hung in the air, and for a moment, it felt like time stood still. Sarah wasn't sure how to respond, but as Dominic stood before her, a father learning how to be vulnerable, she realized that this man, the mafia boss she had once feared, had become someone she could respect, someone who was willing to change, to grow. "I've been so focused on everything else, on controlling every part of my life," Dominic said, his voice full of quiet reflection. "But in doing so, I've neglected the most important thing, my family. Marco. And now I know what matters." Sarah reached out, placing a hand on his arm. "You're not alone in this, Dominic. You never have been." Dominic looked at her, his eyes full of something she couldn't quite place. "Thank you," he said again, his voice full of emotion. You've helped me see the truth. And as Dominic stood there, finally opening his heart to the love he had always kept hidden, Sarah felt a sense of peace settle in her own chest. She had watched him change, and in that change, she saw a reflection of herself, a reminder that we are all capable of growth, capable of transformation, no matter how far we've gone down the wrong path. And with that understanding, the world seemed just a little brighter, a little more full of possibility. Dominic had learned what it meant to truly live, and in doing so, he had made room for love, for connection, and for the family he had once lost sight of. It wasn't about power. It was about something far deeper. And for the first time in a long time, Sarah knew that he was finally ready to be the man his son needed him to be. It had been several weeks since that evening when Dominic had shared his deepest thoughts with Sarah. The quiet yet profound changes that had taken place within him were now becoming evident in every corner of the mansion. What was once a cold and impersonal home filled with tension now felt warm with life, with love. Dominic was not just the mafia boss anymore. He was a father, a man learning to be present, to love, to care. Sarah saw it clearly in the way he interacted with Marco, how he no longer distanced himself from his son, but instead spent hours by his side, teaching him, comforting him, and guiding him with the gentle touch of a father who had finally opened his heart. Yet, even as Dominic had begun to change, Sarah knew that he still had more to learn. There were moments when the shadows of his old life would flicker, reminding him of the power he had once held so tightly. It was in those moments that Sarah realized how much further they both had to go. But she also knew that the journey they were on together was one of healing, one of discovery. One evening, as Sarah was finishing her chores, Dominic walked into the room. His expression was serious, more intense than usual. There was a subtle tension in the air that made Sarah pause what she was doing and look at him. "Sarah," he said, his voice soft but firm. "We need to talk." Sarah turned, her heart beating a little faster. "What's on your mind, Mr. Castellano?" she asked, though the formality in her voice was more out of habit than anything else. Dominic took a step closer, his gaze never leaving hers. "I've been thinking about the future," he began, his words slow and measured. "About Marco's future, about my own future, and about how much I've neglected both." Sarah said nothing, but her heart quickened. She knew where this was going. The past few weeks had brought them closer, but there were still things Dominic had to confront, things that weighed heavily on him. He had spent his entire life building an empire on a foundation of power, control, and fear. And now, as he stared down at the life he had made, he realized that it was all built on the wrong things. "I've made a lot of mistakes," Dominic continued, his voice laced with regret. "I thought I could fix everything with money and force. I thought I could protect the people I loved by controlling them. But I see now that I've only pushed them away." There was a raw honesty in his voice that made Sarah's heart ache for him. She could see the struggle in his eyes, the weight of a lifetime of decisions coming crashing down on him. "Dominic," she said softly, stepping closer to him, "you can't change the past. No one can. But what you can do is shape the future." He looked at her then, really looked at her, as if seeing her for the first time in a way that went beyond the surface. "You've shown me that," he said quietly. "You've shown me that love, real love, isn't about control. It's about trust. It's about being vulnerable. It's about making mistakes and learning from them." Sarah smiled, a small but genuine smile. She had always believed in the power of forgiveness, in the power of change. It wasn't easy, but it was possible. She had seen it in herself, and now, she was seeing it in Dominic. "You don't have to be perfect," she said, her voice calm. "You just have to try, and the fact that you're trying means everything." Dominic let out a deep breath, his posture relaxing slightly. "I don't know if I'll ever get it right," he admitted. "But I want to. For Marco. For you. For everyone I've hurt." Sarah placed a hand on his arm, her touch gentle but firm. "You don't have to do it alone, Dominic. You've already made the first step. You've opened your heart. And that's more than most people ever do." His eyes softened as he looked down at her hand on his arm. "I never thought I could be this man," he said quietly, his voice filled with disbelief. "But I want to be. I don't want to be the man I was before. The man who only knew how to hurt people, to control them. I want to be better. I want to be the father Marco needs. The man you deserve." The sincerity in his voice was almost overwhelming, and for a moment, Sarah felt the walls around her own heart begin to crumble. She had never expected to be here, in this place, standing with the man she had once feared. But now, as she stood beside him, she realized that the man before her wasn't a monster. He was just a man, flawed, yes, but willing to change. And that was more than she could have ever hoped for. "I don't need anything from you," she said softly, her eyes meeting his. "You don't need to prove anything. You've already proven more than enough." Dominic's expression softened, his face showing a mix of relief and gratitude. "Thank you," he whispered, his voice thick with emotion. "Thank you for believing in me." Sarah smiled and gave his arm a gentle squeeze. "You've done the work, Dominic. You've already made the change." He nodded, his lips curling into a small smile. "I guess the real challenge is just being who I am now. And that's all you need to be," she said. In that moment, as they stood together in the quiet of the room, both of them understanding the weight of their words, Sarah realized that this was the start of something new. Not just for Dominic, but for them both. A new chapter, a new beginning. And for the first time in a long time, she felt hope. The future was uncertain, but with Dominic by her side, and Marco in their care, she knew they could face whatever came next. Together, the mansion had never felt more like a home. It was a subtle shift, one that took place over time, but it was undeniable. Marco, the young child whose laughter once felt like a distant memory, was now a constant presence in the house, and Dominic had become the father he had never imagined he could be. The fear that once hung in the air like a thick fog had lifted, replaced by something far more powerful, love. It was in the quiet moments shared between Dominic and Marco, the gentle smiles exchanged, the little gestures of affection that spoke volumes. But, as Sarah had come to realize, Dominic's journey wasn't over yet. The road to healing, to fully letting go of his past, was still ahead. One afternoon, as Sarah was walking through the hall, she noticed Dominic standing in the doorway of Marco's room, watching his son sleep. There was a rare tenderness in his gaze that made Sarah pause. It was a side of him that, until recently, she hadn't known existed. She knew that Dominic was still learning how to navigate this new version of himself. This man who had once believed that strength was measured by control, but now understood that true strength came from being open and vulnerable. "You've come a long way," Sarah said softly, not wanting to startle him. Dominic turned to face her, his expression soft but reflective. "I still don't have all the answers," he admitted, his voice low. "There are times when I wonder if I'm doing enough, if I'm doing this right." Sarah smiled warmly, stepping closer to him. "No one ever has all the answers," she said, her voice steady. "But you're here. That's all that matters." Dominic let out a small breath, as though releasing the weight of the words he had been carrying. He nodded slowly, acknowledging the truth in her words. "I spent so many years thinking that being in control was the only way to protect those I loved. But now, I see how wrong I was." He paused, looking back at Marco, his eyes filled with a mixture of regret and hope. "I don't want to repeat the mistakes I made. I don't want to lose him like I almost lost myself." Sarah could hear the rawness in his voice, the deep fear of failing once again. But she also saw the determination in his eyes, the same determination that had once driven him to build an empire, now being redirected towards something far more important, his family. "You're not going to lose him," she said firmly. "You're already doing everything right by being here, by loving him the way you do." Dominic glanced at her, his gaze searching, as if trying to gauge the depth of her understanding. "I never thought I could be this kind of father," he said softly. "I never thought I could be someone who cares more about his son than about anything else." Sarah stepped closer to him, her voice calm but filled with compassion. "You're not just a father, Dominic. You're a man who has the courage to change, to learn, and to love. That's more than most people ever achieve in their lives." He looked at her for a long moment, as if trying to absorb her words. Then, a slight smile tugged at his lips, a genuine smile that reached his eyes. "I don't deserve to be called a man who can love like that," he said quietly. "But I want to be. I want to be the man Marco needs, the man you deserve." Sarah felt her heart flutter at his words, but she didn't let it show. Instead, she nodded, offering him a reassuring smile. "You don't need to prove anything to anyone. You've already shown your strength in ways that matter most." The silence between them was comfortable, a quiet understanding passing between them, as they both stood there, looking at the boy who had brought them together in this strange and beautiful way. I never thought I'd find peace in my life, Dominic said after a moment, his voice quieter now. But I think I've finally found it. In Marco. In what we've built together, even if it's just the beginning. Sarah felt a sense of pride welling up inside her. Pride not just for Dominic, but for both of them. For the way they had learned to lean on each other, to share in the healing process. Peace doesn't come all at once, she said gently. But it's in moments like these, when we allow ourselves to love and be loved, that we find it. And you found it, Dominic. You found it in Marco, in yourself, and in the love that you're giving. Dominic stood there for a moment, his gaze on Marco, before he turned back to Sarah. Thank you, he said quietly, for everything. For showing me what it means to love, to care, to truly be present. Sarah smiled, her heart full. You don't need to thank me, she replied. You're doing the hard work. I'm just here to walk beside you. As they both stood in the doorway of Marco's room, watching over him, Sarah felt a sense of contentment she hadn't felt in a long time. They were no longer bound by the past, no longer held back by the mistakes they had made. Instead, they were walking toward a new future, one where love and connection were the foundation. And in that moment, Sarah knew that they were ready. Ready for whatever came next, as long as they faced it together. The past had shaped them, but it was the future they were building now. The future where they would not only survive but thrive. And that, she knew, was the true victory. As the weeks passed, the once cold, imposing mansion now hummed with the quiet rhythm of a family coming together. The tension that had once filled the air had been replaced with something softer, something warmer. Dominic had slowly transformed before Sarah's eyes, not just as a father, but as a man. A man who, after years of building walls around his heart, was now learning to let go, to let love in. It had not been an easy road, and there were still moments of doubt, moments where his old habits resurfaced, where he feared losing control. But with Marco, and with Sarah, he was learning to embrace the messy beauty of life, the vulnerability of it, the uncertainty. He had not yet mastered it, but he had begun to understand it. One evening, after dinner, as Sarah made her way to the kitchen to clean up, she felt a shift in the atmosphere. There was something different in the air, something unspoken but tangible. She turned to find Dominic standing in the doorway, his eyes meeting hers with a depth that seemed to carry the weight of everything they had been through together. He stepped forward, his hands clasped in front of him, his usual commanding presence now softened by the humility he had come to know. Sarah, he said, his voice steady but filled with emotion. I need to say something. Sarah paused, the dish she was washing slipping slightly from her hands as she met his gaze. What's on your mind? I've been thinking, Dominic continued, his tone serious, about everything that has happened, about everything I've learned, and about what I still need to learn. Sarah's heart gave a small flutter. She had watched him change, had felt the weight of his transformation, but she knew that even now, Dominic was not yet fully at peace with his past. I've spent my whole life running from feelings, from the things I couldn't control, he said quietly. But in trying to control everything, I lost sight of the most important things, love, trust, and connection. And I've hurt people because of it. But you, Sarah, you've shown me how to start over, how to open my heart again. Sarah felt a warmth spread through her chest. She had never imagined she would hear these words from him. Dominic Castellano, the mafia boss, the man who had once seemed untouchable, was now standing before her, vulnerable and real. You've helped me see that I don't need to control everything, Dominic continued, his voice growing softer. That true strength isn't about power. It's about showing up. It's about being there for the people you care about. Sarah looked at him, her heart full. You've always had that strength in you, Dominic, she said gently. You just didn't see it. But you found it now. He smiled slightly, the corners of his lips turning upward in a way that was completely different from the smirks and sneers she had grown accustomed to. It was a smile that held kindness, vulnerability, and an openness she had never thought possible in him. I don't know if I'll ever fully make up for the mistakes I've made, he admitted, his voice thick with emotion. But I will try every day. For Marco, for you, for the people who matter most. Sarah felt her eyes well with tears, not from sadness, but from the overwhelming sense of pride and hope that filled her. She had watched this man, once so hardened and cruel, become someone who could love, someone who could open his heart, and it was more beautiful than she had ever expected. "You're already doing it," she said softly. "You're doing it every day." Dominic took a step closer to her, his eyes never leaving hers. There was a softness in his expression now, a peace that had not been there before. "Thank you," he said quietly, almost as if the words were not enough to express the depth of his gratitude. "Thank you for believing in me, for helping me see the world differently." Sarah reached out, gently placing a hand on his arm. "You've always been capable of this, Dominic. You just needed to find the right path." He looked down at her hand on his arm, and for a moment, there was a quiet understanding between them. This journey they had both been on, separately, and now together, had brought them to this moment. A moment of acceptance, of forgiveness, and of the beginning of something new. Dominic looked at Marco, who had come into the room silently, watching them with wide eyes. "Marco," Dominic said softly, his voice full of love, "I'm here now. I'm here for you always." Marco smiled up at him, a smile full of innocence and trust, and for the first time, Dominic felt the weight of those words sink in. He wasn't just saying them, he was living them, and in that moment, he realized that the true victory wasn't in the empire he had built, but in the family he had come to cherish. "We'll face whatever comes next, together," Dominic said, his voice firm with determination. "Because this is what really matters." And as Sarah looked at Dominic, and then at Marco, she knew that they were ready. Ready to face the future, ready to heal, ready to love. Together. The journey had been long, but it had brought them to this point. A point where the past no longer defined them. Where love was the foundation of everything they would build moving forward. And for the first time, Sarah felt a deep sense of peace. The hardest battles had been fought, and the reward was more beautiful than any of them had imagined. A family reborn. And that was just the beginning.